virtual learning environments.
And you know, one of the things you need to think about is when you get the results. And in the beginning, you think you have this model in your mind of what the results are going to be, and like it's going to be great. But you got to really think about, well, what happens? What happens if you don't get those results? I mean, what happens if you run this experiment? I mean, you believe, because you're in this, so you know, so I mean, you just can't even imagine that in the real world people would do as good as the people in the virtual. What happens if that's not the case? Don't you think you're going to need to build something in your study that might give you some insight into why you might not get the result? Because, you know, again, in the real world, you can create opportunities for the students to be engaged and to feel very present, just as in the virtual world. So I don't know. I think you're running a real risk by not doing exactly the same measurements in both of your experimental treatments.
And the thing is that the questionnaires are not, you know, we're given that presence just by being there. There's presence. Okay? There's not necessarily, when we talk about the real world.
Just for terminology, just clarify this. As I recall your experiments, you really had three divisions. You had face-to-face, which is real world. Then you had non 2D environment, 2D,
Virtual learning.
so like WebCT or something like that kind of virtual reality. And then you had virtual world. So you have these three major solutions.
And I think you have to measure exactly the same in each of those treatments. So you have to measure engagement and presence and performance.
In other words, you're just not
Yeah,
going to be
I
able to
mean-
compare. You're going to come to the end and it's going to be like...
Catherine, I hear you kind of resisting distinguishing between the psychological engagement and the psychological presence. But it seems to me, and I defer to these experts here, that when at the outset, if you discriminate them and it turns out that they conflate, you're okay. But if you don't discriminate them, afterwards you don't have the data. So the safer course, it seems to me, is discriminate. A little bit extra work, but then later you're safe.
And measure the same things in every one of your treatments. Because really, the basic hypothesis is that if somebody's engaged and they feel present, they're going to do this. And what you're saying is, we've really known that for a long time, but the real difference now is this new technology and this new world that gives it a boost in a way that we don't quite understand, but we're going to try to start figuring out.
Katherine, I've heard you assert several times what you said earlier, that in the real world, presence implies engagement, and in the virtual world, it's the other way around. Engagement implies presence. What is the intuitive basis for that, or has that been demonstrated anywhere? Where do you get that?
I get that from the literature on virtual reality, in which they understand that in order to develop engagement in the real world, I have to be present. If we're doing something virtually, before I can develop a sense of being in a virtual environment, I need to feel engaged with the technology, feel engaged with...
Is that the same thing?
With
Is that
the
the same kind of
experience.
engagement? You just said engaged with the technology. Is that a psychological...
That's not the right word, actually. I have to...
Maybe there's two senses of engagement that you're using. It's easy to happen. These terms like presence and engagement...
I'm also just curious, how much we looked, I can't recall, to organizational learning, other, these gigantic literatures on participation, engagement, all these sorts of concepts, however you want to call them, outside of the virtual reality literature. And there's just gigantic literatures on this. And I think that's needs to be the foundation is that literature, and then then you're applying it to this virtual world, rather than taking this skippy new stuff and
Okay.
applying it back.
I look at engagement in education sense.
Mhm.
It's really
Mhm.
focused on the education literature of engagement, rather than
Mhm.
psychological sense of engagement. But for now, I would have to, if they're considered different, but in the first, like, going back to Dr. Lee's question about the assertion that emergent, that in the virtual world presence is a precursor of engagement, engagement and precursor of presence. The literature on virtual reality has found that users that do not get engaged in the activity by themselves, within the environment, they don't report a sense of presence, or their sense of presence is lower than those that get engaged in the activity through the virtual world.
Okay, I'm monitoring the time. So this was a very useful discussion, and
One final.
Pi has fortunately recorded all of this. Thank you, Pi. I forgot. We have the audio recording of the discussion, so we will get detailed answers.
One summary of that. You can start by thinking how to expand this here, to incorporate all of this, but start the point by instead of having the group presence here, since the engagement is the other factor, okay? And you don't know the direction, okay? This will be determined, and all of those will be fed from the virtual world. So this is a very simple expansion of what you have, which then will go to collaborative e-learning.
And really that virtual world is your independent variable, it's your treatments. So it's a
Okay.
common model, it's the environment. And your environment, you have 3 treatments. You have a face-to-face, you have a web CD, and you have virtual. And so you're measuring exactly its environment, it's these 2 psychological constructs, and then an outcome, a dependent variable.
Very good point. Why the environment is.
And that immersion is interesting too, that immersion,
That's an individual feature.
you probably want to do some demographics that are covariates or some,
Yeah, we talked about that. And maybe make this in 2 parts. The
Psychological engagement.
Right. So you can expand this. If you start from that, then you have the overall picture together, and you can start putting.
Catherine, this is very useful. I mean, you want to get these discriminations clear before you start gathering the data, because if you don't, afterwards it's too late. And the thing that Dr. Sinakis just added there is that the additional hypothesis is which direction. I mean, you have this initial conjecture that in one environment presence precedes engagement, and the other it's the other way around. If you make these discriminations, also between the 2 kinds of engagement,